Turning in our Bibles to Job, book of Job. If you get to Psalms and then just flick back, and you'll arrive at the right destination. I'm going to read Job chapter 1, verse 1 through to chapter 2 and verse 10. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house, and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, "The oxen were ploughing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you." Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil? He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason." Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. All that a man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand. Only spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Amen. Why do bad things happen to good people? Mark Quincy, Patrick Azamkar, Stephen Carroll. I'm sure that question has been asked by many this week. Why do bad things happen to good people? For the Christian, the force of this question is multiplied 1,000 times. If we believe that God is in control, that God is sovereign, then why do bad things happen to good people? And even more pertinently, why do bad things happen to God's people? That's the question that's posed by one of my favourite poets. You may hear a poem from him on Thursday. Gerard Manley Hopkins, in his poem, "Thou art indeed just, Lord," he said, "Why do sinners' ways prosper? And why must disappointment all I endeavour end? Wert thou my enemy, O thou my friend, how wouldst thou worst, I wonder, than thou dost?" The sentiment is very real. But it's not original to Gerard Manley Hopkins, because Job says in chapter 21, "Why do the wicked live, reach old age, and grow mighty in power? Their houses are safe from fear, and no rod of God is upon them." And the implication is, and yet bad things happen to good people. Why? Christopher Ashe lectures at Cornhill, where I attended a few years back. He's also written a most helpful book, I think the most helpful book, commentating on the book of Job, called Out of the Storm. He says that there are two ways that we can approach and seek to answer these questions of suffering. We can answer them from the armchair. In other words, in a place that is remote from suffering, with no attempt to engage or to enter into people's suffering, just to give, as it were, answers on a postcard, neat and theologically robust, matter-of-fact answers. Are armchair answers helpful to people who are suffering? I don't think I would want to hear armchair answers, remote and distant and cold and matter-of-fact answers in suffering. The other option is to seek to approach these questions and answer these questions not from the armchair, but from the wheelchair, engaging with, empathizing with suffering, recognizing your own struggles and doubts and questions concerning suffering. And with God's help, that's what we're going to seek to do as we study through the book of Job. We want to get real on the question of suffering. Let's together really engage with this subject as we enter into Job's suffering over what we're planning as 9 Sunday mornings. If we do enter into it, it will touch us. It will trouble us at the very deep level. But I believe it will also comfort us and strengthen us and build us up as we learn these lessons, not from the armchair, but from the wheelchair. The first passage in Job that we've read together is sometimes called the prologue to the entire story, and it can lead to seemingly endless speculation. People speculate on many of the issues in this chapter, and largely what they're doing is attempting to fill in the blanks of what we're not told, or what we think we should have been told, what we think should have been explained to us. So we'd like to know where us is. We'd like to know when all of this happened. We'd like to know who wrote the book. We'd like to know exactly who the sons of God are. We'd like to know where this cabinet meeting, as it were, was taking place. And we'd really like to know how the evil Satan comes into the presence of a holy God. There are lots of questions that we could speculate on, but let's stick with what we do know. Let's stick with exactly what God wants us to know. And God, in his perfect wisdom, has judged that we need to know. To recognize 5 very simple, straightforward, obvious points that come from this passage. Firstly, Job is a real believer. Job is a real believer. Verse 1, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. And to make absolutely sure that we don't miss this vital preliminary truth, God points Job out to Satan. Verse 8, have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. It's a bit like Blue Peter. Remember how they used to say, here's one I made earlier. So they're making a proper mess of what they're making in front of the cameras, and then just as you think, how are they ever going to get that right, they pull one out from the side and it's perfect, and here's one I made earlier. It's a little bit like that here. You want to know what a real believer looks like? Here's Job, blameless and upright. A man who, while not being sinless, is nevertheless someone of great personal integrity and pure motivation. Blameless, also upright. Someone who walks in close relationship with God. Someone who shows this close relationship with God in their obedience towards God. Job fears God and turns away from evil. He has a solid trust in God. He knows something of how awesome God is. And because he knows something of how awesome God is, he lives out his trust by turning away from evil. His life reflects the holiness of God. We see this borne out for us in his attitude towards his children. His praying and sacrificing for them, fearing that they may have sinned against the holiness of God. So in the evidence of what people can see and what only God can discern, it's absolutely conclusive. Job is a real believer. How do I know an onion is an onion? Well, I know it with my eyes, don't I? As soon as I cut into it, there are floods of tears that come. The evidence of my eyes is that it's an onion that I'm cutting. But I could give it closer inspection. I could peel back the layers. I could place a layer under a microscope. I could examine the onion cells. I don't, but I could. And that would prove beyond doubt that it really is an onion. With Job, you could have seen it with your eyes, that he was a real believer. His personal integrity, his upfront life of obedience and holiness, but also with divine discernment. The layers could have been peeled back. The heart could have been searched. The affections, the motivations, the thoughts. Such an examination that God has obviously carried out on Job proved that Job is a real believer. Are you a real believer? Up front, public, observable, integrity, obedience, holy living. What about beneath the surface? If we were to peel back the layers with divine discernment, the affections, the motivations, the thoughts, what kind of findings would emerge? God searches and knows the heart. He peels back the layers and he sees deep inside. Are you a real believer? It's absolutely vital that we clearly recognize with God that Job is a real believer. Right at the start of this epic story of suffering and trial, Job is a real believer. In fact, he's almost an exemplary believer. Almost an exemplary believer. Verse 8, God says that there is none like him on the earth. Spiritually, he's almost the believer par excellence. Yet that assertion of true trust in God will be battered and blasted and burned in the crucible of suffering on a scale that is almost beyond comprehension to us. And the question will punctuate our study over and over again: is Job still a real believer? It's also important to recognize before we move on that part of the dynamic of the story rests on Job being a rich believer. That's how he's presented here at the beginning. Someone who has so much stuff, someone who has everything. Therefore, also someone who has everything to lose. He has his good health to lose. He has much wealth to lose. He has lots of stuff that could be taken away. So that's Job, the real believer. And as we meet him here at the beginning of the story, he's got lots and lots of stuff, lots to lose. However, the scene changes. In a unique dramatic construction, the scene changes in chapter 1, verses 6 to 12, and again in chapter 2, verses 1 to 6. The reader is transported behind the scenes to a kind of heavenly cabinet meeting, where angelic beings are reporting back to God, reporting before God. It's like a cobra intelligence meeting. And slipping in amongst the sons of God, amongst these angelic messengers or servants, we find the Satan. And God says to Satan in verse 7, "From where have you come?" Satan replies, "From going to and fro in the earth." It's almost like a conversation with a teenager that you may have had at some stage. "What have you been at?" "Oh, just stuff, just doing things." God points out Job to Satan. It's interesting that God takes the initiative there in pointing Job out. He says, "My servant Job, the real believer, there is none like him in all the earth." Satan responds as the accuser, and he says what most people would have been thinking, and maybe what you were thinking as we read the start of the story, verse 9 to 10. Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has? You've blessed the work of his hands and his possessions. They've increased in the land. He's got so much stuff. No wonder he's a believer in you. Satan is the evil accuser. The book of Revelation, chapter 12, verse 10, refers to Satan as the accuser of God's people, one who accuses them both day and night. And here in Job, we have a unique glimpse of the Satan, the adversary, in action, questioning whether or not Job is a real believer, questioning whether or not Job wants God or just stuff that he can get from God. It's no wonder he's a believer. Sure, look how good you've been to him. It's no wonder that he trusts in you. You're not really the true object of his worship. It's the stuff that you've given him. At the bottom of it all, it's stuff that he wants, and not you, God. So if you take away his stuff, he'll just say, "Stuff you." Verse 11, "Stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." That's the first visit to this cabinet meeting. The second visit comes in chapter 2, verses 1 to 6. And Satan intensifies his accusing role. He suggests that Job would say, "Stuff you" to God if the quality of his life was decimated. He only trusts you because he's in such good health. Verses 4 and 5, "All that a man has he will give for his life, but if you stretch out your hand and touch his bone or his flesh, he'll curse you to your face." I don't know about you, but I find that deeply unsettling, that whole scene that is unveiled before us. That Satan could come before God and question whether or not someone is a real believer. One of the reasons I find it so unsettling is not just that it seems to be theologically problematic. I find it unsettling because it makes me think how many of us would be such a problem to Satan that he would even bother making a passing reference to us. You think God would point me out? You think God would point you out and say, consider, put your name in there? Job obviously sticks in Satan's craw. Personal integrity and pure motivation, a solid trust in God, living out his trust in God by turning away from evil, a life that reflects the holiness of God. How many of us would stick enough in Satan's throat for him to even think of accusing us before God? Maybe it would just be so obvious with us that it's stuff that we really do want. It's stuff that we really do worship, and not God. Unsettling. It's about to become almost stomach-churning, because God's response to the evil accusing of Satan is that God allows Satan to inflict suffering on Job. That's the bare truth. God allows Satan to inflict suffering on Job. It's an attack on all the stuff that Satan claims is the real reason that Job trusts in God. First, we find in verses 13 to 19, Satan attacks Job's family stuff, his wealth stuff, his status stuff. The believer who has most to lose, the one who in Satan's estimation is most likely to be a fair-weather believer, just trusting in God because of the things he gets from God. He has all his family and wealth and status stuff wiped out. As we look at these disasters, two of them would have been viewed as the result of human evil. The assault of the Sabians, verse 14. The Chaldeans, verse 17. The other two disasters would have been viewed as natural disasters. What seems like some kind of massive lightning strike in verse 16, and the hurricane in verse 19. Then in the second of Satan's attacks, we find that it's Job's health stuff. His good health is almost decimated. Verse 7, from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, loathsome sores. It's hard for us to imagine. And yet the evidence of this condition from the rest of the book of Job lets us know that this is more than just a bit of acne. These boils result in cracking and oozing and disfiguration, worm infection, fever, darkening and shriveling of the skin, sleeplessness and delirium, choking, bad breath, emaciation, and excruciating pain throughout his body. Stomach churning, yes. And here's the seemingly bitter truth. God allows Satan to inflict suffering on Job. I think we've moved a point early if you just focus on number 3. God allows Satan to inflict suffering on Job. The natural evil and the human evil are inflicted by Satan. I think we can just about digest that. But what brings it up again is the seemingly bitter truth that God allows Satan to inflict this evil on Job that results in such an extremity of suffering. We can't escape that. Verse 12, the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand." Verse 6 of chapter 2, the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand. Only spare his life." God allows Satan to inflict suffering on a real believer. Why? To prove that Job is a real believer. To prove that Job is a real believer to the accuser, and also, I'm sure, to the many, many people who would have followed the life of this patriarchal celebrity. Job was well known. Job was one of the most famous men in that region. The greatest of all the people of the East, verse 3. If they had Hello magazine, Job would have been there, relaxing in his luxurious home with his wife and his 7 sons and daughters, sipping some pomegranate juice and photographer would have been lining up the shot. Everybody would have been glued to the Us News 24 when the report of the demise of Job's empire was breaking news. And the big question on everybody's lips would have been, will he still trust God? Will he still trust God in the midst of such suffering? Why? To prove that Job is a real believer. That gives us something to think about, doesn't it? Maybe we've never considered that as a possible cause for suffering, as a testimony, as a witness to the authenticity of God's salvation in a life. God's servant withstanding the most intense suffering. It gives us something to think about. And yet I'm reluctant to speculate too far. Because in my suffering, and in your suffering, and that of those around us, the curtain is not pulled back. We are not given the opportunity to eavesdrop on a heavenly cabinet meeting. That backstage pass that is given to the reader here in Job isn't afforded to us. So let's be clear. We cannot say with any degree of certainty that our suffering or someone else's suffering has come about because of, and nor should we. We can do so much damage when we bandy about our suggestions and our ideas, our half-baked and ultimately ignorant theories as to why people are suffering. We know the why in Job. Furthermore, the story of Job lets us know that there is a why. But in our suffering, yes, we ask why. Yes, we cry why. But we do not know the answer to the why. Let's stick with what we know. Let's stick with what the text teaches us, with what God is saying to us. But we're still perhaps struggling to digest the seemingly bitter truth that God allows Satan to inflict suffering. I said seemingly bitter truth because I believe that there's a very deliberate, deep down sweetness, if we can use that word, at the center of this painful, stinging hive. God allows Satan to inflict suffering. You say, where's the sweetness in that? Even deep, deep down, where's the sweetness? God allows. Both times, permission has to be given. Both times God places a limit on exactly how far Satan is allowed to go. Listen to the two verses again. The Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. Verse 6 of chapter 2, the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand. Only spare his life. Here's the absolutely central truth that sweetens the bitter truth. God is sovereign in suffering. God is sovereign in suffering. We sometimes talk about something that blows your mind, that you can't get your head around. And this is something that blows our mind, as it were, something that we can't get our head around. It exposes the limited capacity of our understanding of the infinitude of God's mind, God's infinite wisdom. But it is a truth to be believed, not exhaustively understood, but believed. God is sovereign in suffering. A way that I found helps me to deal with this truth is to consider the implications of this not being true. What if this were not true? What if God were not sovereign in suffering? What if Satan could do what he pleased and when he pleased, with God just playing some kind of cosmic catch-up? That's what many, sometimes known as open theists, believe, that God is not sovereign, that Satan's actions somehow take God by surprise. They put him on the back foot. They force him to respond, to try to restore some kind of equilibrium. How infinitely worse is that? How exceedingly bitter, and thankfully how utterly untrue. God's word teaches the sovereignty of God. And while that may leave us with many, many, many questions unanswered, it must bring a deep, deep down, satisfying sweetness. A sweetness in the sovereignty of one who is infinite, eternal, and unchangeable. In his being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. I'm glad that he's in charge. To know that he is our God and we are his people. It has to be the bottom line for the real believer. He is our God and we are his people. And so, though the pain may press hard on me, yet I will trust him. Yes, Satan is the evil accuser. Yes, God allows Satan to inflict suffering. But yes, God is sovereign, even in suffering. And so I will trust him. Job teaches us that real believers trust God no matter what. Yes, they will cry. Yes, they will scream out. Yes, they will struggle. Yes, they will question over and over and over again. But ultimately, deep down, they will trust God. Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Even when he's sitting on the ash heap, scraping his boils with a piece of broken pottery, his own wife taunts him. She wants him to say to God, "Well, stuff you. If that's what's happened to me, then stuff you." To curse God and die. Job says effectively, "You're a fool." Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? Instead of saying, "Stuff you," in all of his pain, in all of his